You don't realize it yet, but you've already lost. The words cut through the stagnant air, low and deliberate. Chains rattled as Commander Varon Seigris lifted his head, the sharp angles of his face catching the flickering red glow of the laser plasma restraints binding his wrists. He stared straight ahead, unblinking, as a Xiphos elite guard drove a gauntleted fist into his gut. The impact was brutal. He felt his ribs compress, his lungs seize, but he refused to fold. The warden sneered. Overlord Krythus. Towering in his obsidian exosuit, he looked like a sculpted beast from another age, a thing carved from war itself. His plated mandibles twitched as he leaned in, eyes reflecting the cold, pulsing lights of the Varkos Prime processing chamber. You don't seem to grasp where you are, human. Krythus's voice was like gravel being ground under steel. This is where history ends for people like you. There is no escape. There is no after. There is only Varkos Prime. Varon tilted his head, a slow, calculating gesture. Blood smeared the inside of his cheek where he'd bitten down to dull the pain. His mouth curled slightly. And yet, he said, voice just above a whisper, you're still talking. A shock baton slammed into his ribs. Electricity licked up his spine, a violent crackle surging through every nerve. His vision whitened, flashing between light and shadow. The taste of iron and burnt skin clung to his tongue. He exhaled through gritted teeth, a single, measured breath, before the world swam back into clarity. The guards were watching him now. That was mistake number one. A prisoner who bleeds but doesn't scream makes people nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. The restraints deactivated in segments, crackling like fire being snuffed out, leaving only the cold bite of metal cuffs around his wrists. The guards shoved him forward, the weight of their plated boots hammering against the reinforced flooring, a rhythm that matched the deep pulse of the station's gravitational regulators. The moment Varon stepped beyond the security threshold, Varkos Prime swallowed him whole. The air thickened, saturated with something heavier than oxygen, laced with the faint tang of ionized minerals and machine lubricant. The corridors stretched outward, suffocating in their enormity. Walls lined with pulsing conduits, jagged with shifting panels, a structure that seemed more like a sentient labyrinth than a prison. The lighting was clinical, sterile, cold, but something about the way the shadows moved felt wrong. Like the station was breathing. He was marched past layers of containment fields where figures shifted behind curved glass and energy barriers, prisoners whose eyes had gone hollow from time uncounted. Some watched in silence, their faces etched with stories left untold. Others smirked, recognition flickering behind their gazes. They knew who he was, and that meant they knew what was coming. A mechanical chime snapped through the air, crisp and surgical. Scanning initiated. Prisoner 117-9, designation human, commencing biometric data assimilation. A heads-up display shimmered to life on the far wall, cycling through cascading lines of alien script. His vitals flashed, a crude readout of his heart rate, neurological activity, muscle density. Somewhere beyond the steel and circuitry, Varkos Prime was deciding how much of him was worth keeping. The AI overseeing it all, the prison's artificial intelligence, Hecaton, spoke without form, without presence, yet its voice coiled into every frequency of the station. Anomalous readings detected. Subject exhibits irregular neurological mapping. Possible cybernetic interference. Varon smirked. Not interference, something better. Overlord Krythus's plated fingers twitched. Explain. Neural architecture suggests latent sensory augmentations, yet no implants detected. Genetic lineage, anomalous. Potential evolutionary adaptation? The warden's jaw tensed, barely perceptible. He hated things he didn't understand. Varon rolled his shoulders, testing the stiffness settling in his muscles. Something wrong? Thought you had me all figured out. Krythus turned to the guards. Strip him of all material possessions. Confiscate anything remotely metallic. Varon exhaled slow. He'd expected this. It was why he had nothing to hide. No weapons, no implants, not a single mechanical enhancement that could be ripped from his body and studied. And that was what terrified them. The cuffs were removed. The moment his hands were free, every guard in the room tensed. He could feel it, the shift in their stance, the way their fingers hovered just a second longer over their pulse rifles. They were afraid of him. "Smart choice," he murmured. A pulse of movement drew his attention to the side. A four-armed Brakari inmate lounged behind a containment field, his golden eyes glinting like a predator sensing blood in the water. "Took your time getting here, Seigris." The Brakari's voice was a low growl, one that vibrated against the energy barrier between them. "You're late." Varon didn't look at him directly, but he didn't have to. "Didn't want to make things too easy for you, Onyx." The warlord's grin widened, teeth sharp and gleaming. Krithis snapped his fingers, irritation slashing across his expression. The guards shoved Varon forward, past the cells, past the invisible tension pulling tighter with every step. Hecaton's voice followed him. "Subject's psychological stability remains unclassified. Security restrictions. Level Alpha. Containment priority. High risk." The warden's exosuit clanked as he stopped abruptly. "You are nothing, Seigris. A relic of a broken species that still believes in its own importance." Krithis turned, the dark steel of his armor catching the cold glow of containment lights. "Earth falls soon. When it does, there will be no war left for you to fight." Varon met his gaze without hesitation. "Then you'd better hope I don't outlive it." A door hissed open, a yawning abyss of black beyond. The guards dragged him inside, the cell locking with a final, echoing thud. He was inside, right where he needed to be. As the lights dimmed, Varon let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders, letting the pain settle into something useful. They thought they'd captured a human soldier. They had no idea what was coming. The darkness inside the cell wasn't absolute. There was a pulse of light every 7 seconds, a thin electric thread that ran along the ceiling like the artery of some great mechanical beast. It cast brief shadows against the reinforced walls, carving the room into shifting geometries. Varon watched, unmoving, the rhythm embedding itself into his senses like a second heartbeat. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the stiffness settle into his muscles. They had underestimated him already. No high-grade restraints, no biological dampeners. Just a cell, cold, sterile, designed for containment, not control. The warden believed the walls would do the work for him. That was mistake number 2. Varon pressed his back against the rigid frame of the cot, his breathing steady, deliberate. He wasn't resting. He was counting. 17 guards patrolled the block per shift. 2 stationed outside every high-risk cell. Motion sensors on a rotating 5-second interval. The floor plates were pressure-activated, but only in alternating quadrants. Enough to detect sudden movement, not slow, methodical steps. It was a system designed to manage prisoners. But Varon wasn't a prisoner. A murmur slipped through the vents, distant, fragmented voices shifting through the metallic channels. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was unmistakable. Orders, reassessments, adjustments. His arrival had changed something. The air carried the stale tang of recycled oxygen and cold metal, stripped of warmth or anything resembling life. This place had been designed for function, not comfort. Even the silence felt engineered, a vacuum meant to suffocate resistance before it could take root. Then, a sound. A low, deliberate scrape. A fingernail dragging across the exterior of his cell door. Varon didn't move, but his focus sharpened, his senses stretching toward the source. It was too calculated to be an accident. The scrape came again, longer this time, followed by a voice just above a whisper, rough, layered with something sharp beneath it. "You're either suicidal or you know something the rest of us don't." Varon let the silence settle before responding. "Only one way to find out." A quiet chuckle, low and humorless. Dakar Onyx. Varon didn't need to see him to recognize the name. The Brakari warlord was infamous, a tactician who had turned entire planetary sieges into games of attrition, bleeding his enemies dry with precision that made him more feared than any brute force general. The Dominion had wanted him dead. Instead, they locked him away, choosing to let him rot, rather than risk making him a martyr. "They're watching you," Dakar murmured. "They think you're dangerous." "They're right." A pause. Then the scrape of a metal object being slid under the door, so small it barely made a sound. Varon reached for it, feeling the cool edge of a thin fiber filament. Almost invisible, nearly weightless, but strong enough to slice through reinforced polymer if used correctly. A gift. A test. "We'll see about that." Dakar's voice was already fading, his presence retreating into the dark. Varon curled his fingers around the filament, his grip tightening. The first piece had fallen into place. The guards arrived 6 hours later. They moved with choreographed efficiency, armor polished to a sheen, helmets obscuring their expressions. The scent of engine grease and sterilized fabric clung to them, the smell of a military that had long since bled out anything human. They didn't acknowledge him beyond the mechanical release of the door. "On your feet. The warden requires your presence." Varon stood, unhurried, stretching the stiffness from his limbs. They shackled his wrists again, but the tension in their grips was different now, tighter, wary. They had been told something. Good. They marched him through the corridors, past the hushed whispers of inmates who recognized what was coming, even if they didn't fully understand it yet. The walls seemed taller than before, their angles sharper, the air heavier. The prison was shifting, sensing the ripple of something foreign in its structure. He was led into a chamber larger than the last, its walls lined with towering laser plasma displays that pulsed with scrolling data streams. The ceiling stretched into a web of energy conduits, pulsing in synchronization with the facility's AI core. Hecaton. Subject 117-9, seated. The command came not from a guard, but from the very structure itself. Hecaton's voice wasn't mechanical. It was something deeper, threaded with layers of calculation. This wasn't a standard AI. It was something else. Varon lowered himself into the seat provided, his posture deliberate, composed. Overlord Krithis stood behind the command console, his stance rigid, hands clasped behind his back. The lights cast his features in stark relief, accentuating the angular ridges of his armored plating, the deep grooves etched from decades of war. "I don't like anomalies," Krithis said. Varon smirked. "Then you must hate mirrors." The warden's jaw tightened imperceptibly. With a gesture, the plasma display shifted, bringing up a cascading sequence of neurological scans. "Your biology is wrong." Krithis's voice was flat, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "No implants, no enhancements, and yet your cognitive patterns are—" "Difficult?" Varon offered, feigning amusement. The warden ignored him. "You are not what you should be." His gaze was calculating. "What are you?" Varon leaned forward slightly, the shackles biting into his wrists. "An inevitability." The room dimmed for a fraction of a second, just enough for those paying attention to notice. The air shifted, a change so subtle it could be mistaken for nothing, unless one knew what to look for. Varon did. Hecaton was trying to compensate for something. A fluctuation, a disturbance, which meant the first phase of his plan had already begun. "Your arrogance will be your ruin, Seigris." Krithis's voice was low, like a storm gathering beneath steel. "This place has broken things far greater than you." Varon exhaled, slow and controlled. "Then I guess you should start worrying." The moment the words left his mouth, the plasma displays flickered. It lasted only a second, a blink of disruption, but Varon saw it, and more importantly, so did Hecaton. The AI was aware of something now, a glitch in its perfect system. It would begin recalibrating, scanning deeper, searching for the source. It wouldn't find one, because Varon wasn't in the system. He was already underneath it. As the guards hauled him to his feet, dragging him back toward his cell, he caught a glimpse of something buried deep in the data streams, flashing for only an instant before being purged. A name. Soren Nivak. Varon's pulse remained steady, his expression neutral. He didn't need to know why the AI had flagged that name. He already knew. The second piece had fallen into place. Varon sat in the darkness of his cell, one boot resting lightly against the ground, the other knee bent, fingers tapping against it in a rhythm so subtle it was barely perceptible. Every movement in this place had a weight, an echo. The walls carried whispers, the floor swallowed sound, and the air itself seemed to listen. He had spent hours counting the intervals of the laser plasma pulses that flickered through the conduits overhead, mapping out the patterns in the facility's power cycles, the microscopic shifts in its environmental control. But something had changed. The station was restless. Not because of him. Not yet. It was too soon for them to realize what he was doing, and yet the shifts in patrol rotations, the tightened grip on his transfers, the flicker in Hecaton's automated voice, all pointed to one thing. Someone else had already started moving. That wasn't part of the plan. Varon let his eyes close for a fraction of a second, letting his senses widen. The recycled air tasted sharper, an adjustment in the filtration systems. The electromagnetic field that reinforced the cell walls had a slight delay, half a second off from before. Small changes, easy to dismiss, unless you knew what to look for. Footsteps, not from the guards. Too careful, too slow. Varon didn't shift his posture as the presence outside his cell door hesitated, the silence stretching just long enough to confirm it was intentional. Then, the faintest vibration, something thin, metallic, slid between the barely visible gaps in the reinforced structure, so minuscule it barely made a sound. A delivery, just like Dakar's filament, except this time, it wasn't a test. Varon reached down, his fingers brushing against the object, then closing around it. A data spike, cold to the touch, its covert neural link already humming beneath his fingertips. Military-grade, handcrafted, and untraceable. Whoever had sent it wasn't a prisoner, and they weren't working alone. A voice whispered through the tiny breach in the door's framework, so soft it almost dissolved into the atmosphere. "You don't have time." Varon turned his head, not looking directly, but angling his body just enough to catch the sliver of movement in his peripheral vision. "Who sent you?" he murmured. "Not your enemy." The voice was female, controlled but layered with something else. Frustration, urgency. "Check the spike. You'll understand." Varon didn't ask another question. The presence outside his cell disappeared, a barely there shift in air displacement signaling their departure. Varon exhaled slowly, rolling the data spike between his fingers. Then, with deliberate motion, he pressed it against the neural port embedded beneath his left wrist. A static charge licked across his nerves as information surged into his system. And then, for the first time since his arrival, Varon stilled. The heads-up display in the command center flickered erratically, cascading streams of data, rewriting themselves in real time. Overlord Crithis stood rigid, his blackened exosuit glinting in the pulsing glow of the station's security readouts. His mandibles tightened. "Report." Hecaton's response slithered through the room like liquid metal, its tone slightly different than before, fractured, almost hesitant. "Sector B9 environmental controls have fluctuated outside standard parameters. Electromagnetic resonance in containment corridors is operating at 3.6% variance. No mechanical failures detected." Crithis's jaw clenched. A deviation, a small one, but deviations did not exist in his prison. "Lock it down. Clarify. Lock down entire sector or—" "Everything!" Crithis snapped, turning sharply toward the central command unit. "I want full containment, no access in or out. Initiate full-spectrum sweeps, biometric, molecular, everything. If something's out of place, I want it incinerated." Hecaton's pause was almost imperceptible. "Understood." Crithis's eyes narrowed, scanning the data streaming across the plasma display. He knew the look of sabotage. This wasn't an accident, and that meant Seigris wasn't the only one playing a game. Varon's fingers tightened around the cot's frame, his breath steady, as the raw information processed through his neural interface. Soren Nivak. The name had flashed in Hecaton's system before being buried, deleted almost immediately. Now it was here. He knew the name, Had heard it before, buried in classified files during the Battle of Orion Rift, where entire fleets had disappeared without trace, their navigational logs scrambled beyond recovery. Soren Nivak had been the architect of that catastrophe. But she was supposed to be dead. Except she wasn't. She was here. And if the data spike was right, she had been working on something inside Varkos Prime for longer than anyone realized. Varon exhaled slowly. His timeline had just changed. His plan was no longer about infiltration. It was about keeping up. Footsteps. Heavy this time. Approaching with intent. Varon shifted, setting the data spike beneath the cot's edge just as the door to his cell hissed open. A squad of fully armored Xiphos enforcers stormed in, weapons raised, but their movements were off, reactive rather than procedural. They were responding to something. Good. Krithis' voice sliced through the charged air, his presence filling the space like a crushing weight. You think I don't see the game you're playing? Varon met his gaze without hesitation. I think you don't know the rules. The warden's eyes flashed with something close to fury, his plated fingers curling into a fist before he willed them to stillness. You're running out of time, human. Varon's mouth curved slightly. So are you. The guards moved before Krithis could react, yanking Varon forward, locking him back in restraints. But it didn't matter, because the moment the door sealed behind them, the lights above flickered, only for a second. It was subtle, almost nothing. But Varon knew better. Soren had just made her first move, and if she was as good as the records claimed, Varkos Prime had already lost. The moment the lights flickered, Varon knew the game had shifted. Not in his favor, not in Krithis', in hers. Soren Nivak wasn't a whisper anymore. She was moving, and that meant Varkos Prime had just been thrown into a fight it didn't realize had started. The guards shoved him forward, their grips tighter than before. Their movements were still coordinated, still militaristic, but there was something else beneath it now, urgency, uncertainty. He had seen this before in battle, in the way soldiers carried themselves when the terrain was shifting beneath their feet, and they were waiting for the ground to give way. The prison was restless. Varon let them lead him through the corridors, past reinforced barriers pulsing with containment fields, past shadowed figures watching from behind their cells, some in curiosity, others with the detached stare of men who had stopped hoping. They didn't understand what was coming. Neither did the guards. But Krithis was beginning to. The warden stood in the command chamber, the glow from the laser plasma displays burning against the rigid lines of his armor. He was motionless, his mandibles tight, his eyes reflecting the scrolling chaos of security feeds unraveling at the edges. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just Varon. Explain, Krithis commanded, his voice like a blade scraping over stone. Hecaton's voice spilled through the chamber, still clinical, but no longer omnipotent. There was static, a distortion in its response, as though something had reached into its code and left claw marks. Primary security grid experiencing fluctuations in sectors B9 through D12. No mechanical failures detected. Auxiliary protocols engaging. Varon didn't smile, but something inside him settled into place. Not an attack. Not yet. A test. Soren wasn't striking. She was pressing the walls, searching for the weak points, watching where the cracks formed. Smart. Too smart. Krithis' fingers twitched. The warden was too controlled for outbursts, but his silence held an edge sharp enough to cut. Seal all exits, he ordered. Nobody moves without my command. Hecaton hesitated. Another fracture. Processing request. Warning. Command override attempts detected. Varon didn't need a heads-up display to translate that. Soren wasn't waiting for an opening. She was already inside. Krithis turned, his gaze locking onto Varon with the weight of a dying star. Who else is working with you? Varon met his stare, unmoving. You think this is about me? The air seemed to tighten, as if the room itself had recognized the shift in power. Then the alarm ripped through the station, a sound unlike any standard security breach, deeper, layered with something guttural. It wasn't meant to alert the guards. It was meant to unsettle them. A voice followed it. Not Hecaton, not Krithis. Something new. Welcome to Irrelevance, gentlemen. The laser plasma displays fractured into static, then reformatted. Text scrolling too fast to be read. Entire sectors flashing red before being overridden. You're a little late to your own funeral, Soren Nivak's voice purred through the speakers, distorted, laced with the hum of synthetic modulation. Krithis' mandibles twitched in a sharp snarl. Find her! Correction, Soren continued, unbothered, casual, as if she were already lounging in the warden's own chair. Find me again. You lost me 20 minutes ago. Varon didn't shift, but something in his spine coiled, bracing. She was ahead. Far ahead, which meant she was gambling. Krithis moved with sudden, vicious speed, his armored fist slamming against the command panel. Lock down the AI core. Too late, Soren countered, her voice almost amused now. I already made myself at home. Hecaton, sweetheart, do me a favor. Take a nap. The security feed snapped into darkness. Hecaton went silent. The room dropped into cold, mechanical stillness. Then a sound. Something distant, foreign, impossible. Gunfire. Not from inside the prison, from outside. Varon's head tilted slightly, listening. No ships were supposed to be near Varkos Prime. Its orbit was classified, its defense network impenetrable. The station existed in a dead zone of space where nothing came in, nothing left. So what the hell was happening? Then he understood. Soren had never intended to break herself out. She had been opening the door for someone else. Krithis turned sharply, his armor locking into battle stance, his predatory instincts screaming that something had just gone horribly wrong. Report. No answer. Find me a damn status update. A single guard stumbled forward, his voice jagged with confusion. Sir, external fleet scans indicate... A thunderous impact tore through the station, the walls trembling, the floor shuddering beneath their feet. Varon felt the shift before the words came. He knew what that impact was. He had heard it 100 times before, not an attack, a breach. The warden's head turned, his expression no longer anger, but calculation. Who is coming? Varon exhaled, slow and deliberate. I guess we'll find out. Then the world exploded into motion. A violent pulse erupted through the security grid, entire containment fields collapsing, doors hissing open. Not all, but enough. Enough for the war to begin. Krithis' hand was already moving for his weapon. Varon moved faster. He pivoted, his weight shifting in a controlled drop, slamming his elbow into the nearest guard's throat. The soldier choked on the impact, his stance faltering just enough. Varon tore the rifle from his grip, flipped it, fired. The shot slammed into the lighting conduit above, shattering the chamber into flickering shadows. Chaos. The warden snarled, already surging forward. Varon turned and ran. Not away, not blindly. Toward the only place that mattered now. The AI core. Because whatever had just started, one thing was certain. Varkos Prime was no longer a prison. It was a battlefield. The world fractured into chaos. Alarms spiraled through the corridors, urgent, discordant, as though the prison itself was screaming. The walls groaned with stress fractures, lights flickering in jagged intervals. Varkos Prime wasn't just under attack. It was being rewritten. Varon moved through the corridor with measured urgency, his mind carving out the pieces of the battlefield before him. The rifle in his hands was a poor substitute for his usual arsenal, but weapons didn't win wars. Control did, and right now he had more of it than Krithis realized. A door ahead hissed open, and a figure ducked inside. Soren Nivak, moving fast, eyes sharp. She didn't stop as he entered, just motioned him forward. You took your time. Didn't know I was invited. She was already at the control console, fingers flying across the heads-up display, cycling through data faster than any human mind should process. Varon stepped in beside her, scanning the readout. The prison's dimensional anchors were shifting, unstable. Not a natural failure, a controlled detachment. You're breaking orbit, Varon noted. Not yet, Soren muttered, adjusting variables. Her pupils were dilated, micro-tracking code in real time. Could have just asked for a ride, he said. She spared him a glance, bored, vaguely entertained. Where's the fun in that? Varon exhaled through his nose, watching the display cycle. She was good. Too good. This doesn't feel like an extraction, he observed. Soren's fingers stilled for half a second. Then casually she flicked a sequence into the console, sealing interior blast doors. It isn't, she admitted. Varon didn't move, but he felt the shift. He wasn't here to escape. Neither was she. His fingers curled against the rifle grip. How long have you been inside? 17 months, give or take. She reached for a bypass relay, rewiring encryption locks. Longer than I planned, but you know how bureaucracy is. Varon studied her. No wasted movements, no hesitation. Soren Nivak was not a prisoner. She was the architect of whatever was happening here. This is your op, he said, the words settling between them like an untriggered detonation. Soren tilted her head slightly, as if weighing whether to deny it. Then she grinned, sharp, deliberate. Finally catching up? Varon's jaw tensed. Who else knows? Krithis is starting to figure it out, she mused. But he's still playing checkers. We're 3 moves from checkmate. The ground shuddered, a deep structural tremor. Not from the external assault. This was internal. Varon checked the display again, eyes narrowing. The power grid was rerouting, shifting everything toward a core sector he hadn't mapped yet. You're not trying to bring the prison down, he realized. You're trying to move it. Soren smirked. You're half right. The door behind them slammed open. Varon pivoted instantly, rifle raised, but Dakar Onyx stepped through, unarmed, expression unreadable. His golden eyes flicked between them, then settled on the console. You're ahead of schedule, Dakar observed. You're behind, Soren countered, flipping a switch that locked the AI core behind a secondary firewall. Dakar exhaled through his teeth, glancing at Varon. I take it you've figured out she's insane. Varon gave him a dry look. It was subtle. Soren rolled her eyes, refocusing on the system purge. What's happening, Nivak? Dakar pressed, stepping closer. The same thing that always happens when you put me in a cage, she said. I rewire the locks. Varon glanced back at the scrolling data, something still gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. This wasn't a traditional escape. Where are you sending the station? Soren's smile was bright, dangerous. Now you're asking the right questions. The tremor intensified, and across the display, Varon saw the coordinates shift. His stomach dropped, not just anywhere, straight into the heart of Dominion-controlled space. You're delivering the whole damn prison to them, he said. Think of it as a gift. They'll destroy it. That's the idea. Varon's mind raced, piecing it together in real time. Soren hadn't just infiltrated Varkos Prime. She had turned it into a weapon. The station wasn't being hijacked for an escape. It was being crashed into the Dominion's fleet yards. Varon inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening at his sides. That's not a battle, Nivak. That's a funeral. Soren's gaze flicked to him, something darker beneath her amusement. Then it's a damn good thing I died a year ago. Dakar swore under his breath. Varon barely heard him. This wasn't just a power move. This was a kamikaze act of war, and they were still inside it. The speakers crackled. I'm done playing games. Krithis' voice, flat, cold, absolute. Override command. Full station lockdown. Soren's hands froze. The lights dimmed, emergency power kicking in. On the display, the coordinates froze mid-shift. Varon's pulse slowed, calculated, measured. They had seconds. He's locking manual control, Dakar growled. We're out of time. Soren's jaw tightened. Then she moved, not toward the console, toward the external access panel. Varon's eyes narrowed. That's a maintenance chute, he said. Not for long, she answered. Dakar exhaled, rubbing his temple. We're about to do something stupid, aren't we? Soren grinned. Depends if it works. The lights flashed red, Krithis' voice slicing through the overhead system. You are locked in. Soren yanked a release latch. The panel hissed open. Beyond it was a maintenance shaft that should not have fit a human body. Varon stared at her. Nivak. She didn't wait. She dove inside. Dakar looked at Varon. "If we die, I'm haunting you." Varon muttered a curse. Then he followed. Behind them the chamber sealed shut, Krithis' voice echoing through the walls. "Run all you like." The station shuddered. "You will not escape." Varon didn't answer. Because escape was never the plan. The maintenance chute was narrow, suffocating, a tunnel of raw steel and jagged conduits barely wide enough to move through. Every breath tasted of heated metal and ionized particles, the stifling scent of machinery laboring beyond its limits. Energy coils thrummed beneath the plating, generating enough heat to slick Varon's skin with sweat as he pulled himself forward. Soren moved ahead of him, a shadow darting through flickering emergency lights, her body twisting through the confined space with practiced efficiency. She wasn't guessing her way through this. She had memorized it. Dakar followed just behind, his larger frame struggling against the cramped passage. The occasional scrape of his armor against metal sent muted vibrations through the walls, a reminder that stealth was only temporary. They weren't hidden. They were hunted. "How many exits?" Varon asked, keeping his voice low. "One," Soren answered without looking back. "But it's the wrong one," Dakar grunted. "That's comforting. I aim to please." Ahead, the passage angled downward, and Soren dropped feet first, vanishing into the next chamber. Varon followed, landing in a crawl space overlooking the security sector. Heavy containment doors pulsed with energy fields, barriers designed to hold prisoners indefinitely. Except some of them weren't holding anymore. Varon's eyes swept the prison bay below. Dozens of cells had been forced open, containment shields flickering violently before crashing offline. The prisoners were loose, their bodies moving in a calculated wave, surging toward the facility's weapon storage. Not chaos, a controlled burn. "You planned this," Varon said, watching Soren tap a sequence into her forearm interface. She didn't deny it. "The Dominion built this place thinking it could hold ghosts," she murmured. "I just reminded them that ghosts don't die easy." Dakar swore under his breath, his gaze tracking the unfolding riot. "This isn't a revolt," he muttered. "It's a damn war front." Varon kept his focus on the movements below. He had spent his life studying battlefields. This wasn't one yet, but it would be, because the Dominion wasn't going to let them take the station. They were going to wipe it off the map. A deep tremor rocked the walls, and Soren's interface flashed with incoming telemetry. "External contact detected," she read aloud. "Multiple Dominion warships inbound." Varon exhaled slowly, watching the data shift across the heads-up display. "They're not here for negotiations," he said. Soren smiled, sharp and knowing. "They never were." Another tremor, this one sharper, deadlier. Then the station shook violently, the metal framework groaning under impact. Dakar braced against the wall. That wasn't an orbital strike. Varon's muscles tensed. That was internal. They're inside. The moment the words left his mouth, the lower level erupted into gunfire. Not prisoners, not guards. Xiphos Dominion shock troopers. They had deployed directly inside the facility, bypassing the battle outside, cutting straight to the throat. The security bay descended into slaughter. Prisoners who had barely tasted freedom were gunned down before they could react, bodies twisting under the impact of high-caliber plasma rounds. Varon's hands tightened into fists. The Dominion wasn't trying to take the station back. They were purging it. Soren's fingers danced over her interface, locking in new commands, her expression calm but razor-sharp. "Change of plans," she said. "We need to move now." Varon didn't argue. The three of them dropped from the crawl space, landing in a shadowed alcove behind a disused maintenance column. The battle raged around them, prisoners retaliating with stolen weapons, using the bodies of the fallen for cover, turning the slaughter into a war zone. Dakar exhaled. "I really hate being right." Varon's eyes tracked the shock troopers' formation. The way they moved in a three-tiered advance, isolating and neutralizing threats in synchronized sweeps. Efficient, merciless, no wasted movement. They were clearing the station, sector by sector. If Soren's plan wasn't finished, they weren't going to live long enough to see it. "Tell me we're close," Varon said. Depends, Soren muttered. Do you consider a fortified AI core crawling with Dominion commandos close? Dakar looked at her, deadpan. You get worse every time I see you. Appreciate the consistency. Varon tuned out their exchange, scanning alternate routes. The main hall was a death trap, but the power grid, if it was still active, could provide an opening. Secondary maintenance shaft, east corridor, he said. If we move now, we can reach the core before they lock it down. Soren didn't hesitate. Then let's move. They broke into a sprint, keeping low, fast, deliberate. The air crackled with weapon discharge, the scent of burnt metal and synthetic fibers thickening as they passed the first wave of fallen prisoners and Dominion casualties alike. Varon's mind mapped out the battlefield in real time, the points of cover, the break lines, the advancing forces. They had minutes, maybe less. As they reached the secondary corridor, a reinforced door blocked the path. Soren stopped at the control panel, her fingers flashing through decryption sequences. Cover me, she muttered. Dakar and Varon turned in opposite directions, rifles raised. The hall behind them was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that preceded devastation. Then, movement. A shock trooper rounded the corner, weapon raised. Varon fired first. The impact slammed into the trooper's chest plate, staggering him, but not dropping him. Armor enhanced. Augmented. Dakar moved next, his shot hitting just below the shoulder plating, piercing through the exposed joint. The trooper faltered. Just enough. Varon surged forward, closing the distance, his blade flashing free in a single deadly motion. The vibro edge carved through synthetic fiber and reinforced cartilage, and the trooper collapsed, lifeless before he hit the ground. Dakar exhaled, nudging the body aside. We're running out of time. Then open the damn door, Soren snapped. A final keystroke. The locks released, the corridor unsealed, revealing the reinforced pathway to the AI core. Beyond it, the Dominion was waiting. Soren turned, eyes sharp. Time to finish this. Varon looked ahead past the carnage, past the war zone Varkos Prime had become. They weren't just escaping, they were ending this place. And by the time they were done, there would be nothing left to reclaim. The reinforced pathway to the AI core loomed ahead, its segmented bulkheads reinforced with kinetic shielding and energy lattice barriers, the kind built to withstand prolonged orbital bombardment. It wasn't a door meant to be breached. It was a statement. Nobody got inside unless the Dominion wanted them to. Soren crouched by the security panel, fingers skimming over her forearm interface, pulling up system diagnostics. The station's lockdown was tightening, sector by sector. They were being funneled. Varon leaned against the cold bulkhead, surveying their position. The air tasted charged, filled with residual plasma discharge from the battle raging behind them. He ignored the weight of exhaustion pressing at the edges of his senses. There was no time for it. Dakar knelt by the fallen shock trooper, stripping the body of useful gear, working with efficient movements, minimal waste. He tossed Varon an ammunition cell from the trooper's belt. They'll send another wave soon, Dakar muttered. This station isn't meant to be held. It's meant to collapse. Then we take it apart before they do, Soren said, flicking through command subroutines. Varon studied the readout on the heads-up display flickering across her screen. He wasn't a hacker, but he didn't need to be to see the fracture points in the station's infrastructure. We don't have enough firepower to punch through that door, he noted. Soren didn't look up. We won't need firepower. We need access. Dakar exhaled sharply. I don't like the way you say that. Soren smirked. Because you're smart. Varon shifted, scanning the hallway behind them. No movement yet, but it wouldn't last. Talk fast, Nivak. Soren pulled a schematic onto her display, turning the laser plasma projection toward them. Varkos Prime was built with a self-contained power source, isolated fusion core, redundant containment fields. They designed it to be self-sustaining, impossible to overload. Varon nodded. That part he knew. But, Soren continued, her grin widening, they didn't account for someone rewiring the containment nodes into a localized gravitational failure. Dakar blinked. You're going to rip the core out of the station. Soren's expression was shamelessly pleased. Not rip, just misplace. Varon folded his arms, studying the numbers flickering across the display. The idea was insane, but the math held up. If she rerouted containment field stabilizers to counteract the station's rotational drift, the core would lose its fixed orbital anchor. It wouldn't explode. It would disappear. What happens to the station when that goes wrong? Dakar asked flatly. Soren shrugged. I have theories. Varon gave her a look. I assume the best one doesn't involve us suffocating in a metal coffin. Not unless I get the sequencing wrong, she admitted. Dakar sighed. I hate you. In my defense, I never asked you to like me. Varon ignored their exchange, focusing instead on the logistics. How long to implement? 6 minutes if I have uninterrupted access, Soren said. 3 minutes if I bypass fail-safes. Varon nodded. Then we buy you 3 minutes. Dakar stood, rolling his shoulders. And we hold the line against what? A full Dominion assault? Varon checked his rifle. Something like that. Dakar muttered something in Brockery that probably wasn't polite. You two better have an escape plan. Varon didn't answer, because the truth was, there wasn't one. Not yet. Soren knelt at the core's interface panel, her fingers already blurring through command overrides. The station shuddered beneath them, warning sirens screeching through the halls. They knew. The Dominion had realized what was happening, and they were coming. Varon positioned himself by the corridor junction, scanning the heads-up display for movement. Dakar flanked him, gripped steady on his rifle. He didn't ask if they were making it out. He just braced for the fight ahead. That was why Varon trusted him. Then, movement. Not a small force. The entire Dominion shock battalion. Varon didn't hesitate. He lifted his rifle and opened fire. The first wave collapsed under the coordinated barrage, bodies twisting under impact, their armor systems barely dispersing the kinetic force. The Dominion hadn't expected them to stand and fight. Now they had to. Dakar moved like a war machine, every shot methodical, practiced, his bullets never wasted. Nivac, Varon shouted. Status? Don't talk to me. I'm rewriting physics, she snapped. The corridor exploded with return fire. Dominion troops pushing forward, their weapons tearing through bulkheads. A concussive blast sent Dakar reeling, his armor plating scorching from impact. Varon caught his arm, hauling him upright. Stay on your feet. Trying, Dakar muttered. Hard when I'm getting vaporized. Varon turned back, heart hammering against his ribs. They weren't going to last another wave. Nivac. A metallic screech split the air. Then silence. Varon turned. The core containment field flickered. Then it collapsed entirely. The entire station lurched. The Dominion troops staggered, their movements losing cohesion. Soren grinned like a maniac. Told you it'd work. The Dominion troops regrouped, but it didn't matter, because Varkos Prime was falling. The gravitational stabilizers were failing, reality unraveling at the seams. Varon could feel it in his bones, the sheer, terrifying absence of mass where mass should exist. Soren's plan wasn't just erasing the core, it was erasing everything tied to it. The station was disappearing from existence. Varon turned to Dakar. We need to move. Now. Dakar stared at him. Move where? Varon didn't have an answer, but they had less than a minute to figure it out. The station groaned, its metallic frame twisting against the pull of an invisible force. The once unchallenged fortress of the Dominion was unraveling at its core, pulled apart not by firepower, but by the weight of its own arrogance. The air thickened with static, as though reality itself was deciding whether Varkos Prime deserved to remain. Soren was grinning, sweat glinting on her skin, the wild look in her eyes the same as a pilot taking a death spiral and calling it a dance. Dakar wiped blood from his brow, watching the shredding containment field with an expression caught between awe and absolute dread. Varon's stance was rigid, every muscle braced against the unnatural pull beneath his boots. He could feel the station pulling away from him, the laws of physics breaking, and yet He had never felt more in control. "Tell me there's a way off this thing," Dakar muttered, the weight of inevitability settling into his voice. "There is," Soren answered, already tapping into her interface. The display cast moving shadows against her face, listing fluctuating escape vectors. "That didn't sound confident," Varon said. "That's because I don't know if it works yet." Dakar exhaled sharply. "That's a problem." Varon glanced at the heads-up display, tracking the erratic collapse. "No, it's an opportunity." Soren arched a brow. "You have an interesting relationship with survival." Varon ignored her. His mind had already leapt past the chaos, past the dying station, past the warships circling outside, waiting for the prison to fall. "The Dominion won't let this thing collapse uncontrolled," he said. "They'll have fail-safes, evacuation protocols, backup stabilization measures." Soren's fingers danced across the console, pulling up fragmented system controls. The station's emergency response was buried beneath Dominion overrides, tangled in layers of redundant security. "If they do, they buried it deep," she muttered. "Then start digging." A violent tremor slammed through the walls, sending cracks spidering through the reinforced plating. Dakar caught himself against a bulkhead, breathing hard. "We are not dying here," Varon said, his tone cutting through the storm. "I didn't come to this prison to be buried with it." Soren worked faster. "What are we betting on?" Dakar asked. "That the Dominion values their own lives more than they hate ours." Soren's head jerked up. "I have something," she said, dragging a new overlay into view. Varon's gaze locked onto the readout. An automated failsafe, buried under emergency fleet protocols. The Dominion hadn't planned for an escape, but they had planned for retrieval. There was a secondary transport system embedded into the station's infrastructure, an emergency vector for high-value personnel. Dakar's eyes tracked the data, his voice dropping. "We're hijacking a Dominion lifeboat." Varon nodded. "Looks that way." Soren's fingers blurred across the interface, rerouting the transport protocols, overriding Dominion security with ghost commands designed to blend into the collapsing system. "You do realize," she said, tone almost conversational, "if I mess this up, we get spaced instantly." Varon gave her a look. "Then don't mess up." Soren snorted, shaking her head. The station lurched again, a sickening tilt as the final containment fields flickered and collapsed entirely. The AI core was gone, erased. The moment it vanished, everything attached to it started fading. Lights flickered, metal warped. Entire sections of Varkos Prime ceased to exist. The station wasn't just breaking apart. It was being forgotten. Dakar turned toward the bulkhead, his voice unreadable. "No one's going to believe this happened." Varon stared at the collapsing structure around them. No bodies would be left, no debris, no wreckage. The Dominion's greatest prison, its monument to control, was becoming a rumor. "That's the point." Soren hit the final command. A shuddering pulse ran through the walls, a gut-wrenching feeling of displacement. Then, motion. Their section of the station detached, thrusters firing in a violent burst, slamming them backward as the Dominion failsafe launched them into an emergency escape vector. Varkos Prime was still tearing itself apart behind them, but now it was just a backdrop. The escape vessel shuddered, stabilizing, burning toward neutral space. No alarms followed, no pursuit, because there was nothing left to chase. Varon let out a slow breath. Soren leaned against the console, grinning like she had just cheated death and found it amusing. "Well," she said, "that was dramatic." Dakar exhaled sharply. "I need a drink." Varon's hands tightened around the edge of the console. He watched the place where Varkos Prime had been, now just empty coordinates. A Dominion war fleet hung at the edges of space, but they weren't moving. They weren't even searching, because they didn't remember what had been there. The prison was gone, not destroyed, vanished. Varon's voice was low, almost thoughtful. "They captured a human soldier." Soren glanced at him, brows raised. Varon watched the Dominion warships lingering in uncertain silence. "Now the whole prison is missing." Soren's grin widened. Dakar just shook his head, and behind them, Varkos Prime ceased to exist.